good evening and welcome here to tonight's episode of the Earth, Air, Fire and Water series that 5x15 have been doing with Rathbones Investment Management, and we're really thrilled to be bringing you the third one, which actually is about air, not quite in the right sequence, but nevertheless it's going to be fantastic. We've done two so far. We have done Earth, when we talked about everything from rewilding, green capital, better solutions for food. And then last month we did a panel on water, and we learned about oceans, rivers, global water shortages, in particular the drought in the River Po. And it was very moving and very wonderful. And tonight's installment of this series is going to be about air, and it promises to be just as good, just as informative, and because of some of our speakers, just as moving. I'm very pleased that we're going to be talking about air, especially on the day that the new IPCC report has come out, which, sets out absolutely categorically, as one of our speakers tonight, Gabrielle Walker, is going to explain, that we have got to take carbon out of the air in order to have a chance of holding our global climate targets to 1.5. And that's going to be tough. But Gabrielle's who is right at the cutting edge of this new technologies, is going to be telling us this story. And I'm pleased to say it's a very hopeful one as well. But air is, again, one of those bits of natural capital that is really very hard to get your hands around, because you literally can't get your hands around it. It's everywhere around us. It was something that was never thought that you would have to pay for, never thought that could be destroyed. But in fact, what we've done with the fossil fuels that we have pushed into the air, into the atmosphere, is that we have altered the composition of the air we breathe. And for some people, in particular, the daughter of our first speaker, it has had tragic consequences. And I think we all probably have seen the figures that talk about the numbers of people every year who die from air pollution, or indeed whose lives are cut short, who have lousy lungs and who just don't thrive, especially children. So it's extraordinarily important, very difficult to legislate about, and hard, as I say, to get your head around, because it's the stuff you can't see. However, we're going to do our best in the next hour to unpack what we can. The format is the same as the other ones. Our speakers are going to tell you about their particular twist on this subject for 5 or 6 minutes to begin with. Then I'll chat to each of them a bit, and then please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll come to them for the last 15 minutes or so of tonight's session. Please, as I say, put your questions into the Q&A box. Sorry, not the chat box, the Q&A box. So with no further ado, I'm very, very happy to introduce our first speaker tonight, who's Rosamond Adu-Kissi-Debrah, whose name is probably, sadly, familiar to most of you watching us tonight, because Rosamond became a clean air campaigner as a result of a really just simply terrible family tragedy, in that her daughter Ella died in 2013. I can't quite believe it's 10 years ago now. And she was the first person in Britain, indeed I think in the world, whose cause of death went down due to asthma attacks brought on by the air that this little girl had breathed. Now, her mother triumphantly has turned this tragedy into an absolutely sensationally powerful and influential and important campaign. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome her here. She's been awarded a CBE, she's been made Woman of the Year by Woman's Hour, and landed with lots of plaudits. But personally, I think that she's just astonishingly brave to turn a family tragedy into a campaign to help save other lives. So Rosamond, over to you, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, and I join you from St. Martin's in the Fields, where tonight with the Mayor we're going to be discussing ULAs, which is one of the out of Ella's inquest. There were a number of recommendations that came out of it. But let's start. We always need to start somewhere. So let's start by saying air pollution is the biggest environmental threat of our time. And you started off by saying that every year between 7 and 9 million people die. And out of that figure, we need to bear in mind that 500,000 of those are children before the age of 5. It is that serious. And unfortunately, Ella was one of those children. So where are we for today? I like to talk about since the inquest, because there was a before the inquest and there's been since the inquest. And the reason why I say since the inquest is a lot of people now have heard about her story, but I do think it is very important that people understand what the coroner's recommendations were. So a lot of people know that air pollution is now on her death certificates, but what does that actually mean? What did the coroner say to the government, to the mayor, and to councils around the UK? So the first thing the coroner was very, very clear about, this isn't just one person's responsibility, and all the parties need to work together to get to where we actually need to get to. So firstly, he told the government they need to, as a minimum, so I always now have to stress the word minimum, they need to adopt WHO guidelines. Now, when he came to the recommendations, he did them in April, and the new guidelines did not come into existence until September. So he purposely did not have a date on them. So when I now speak, I am not referring to the guidelines in 2005. I am referring to the new guidelines in 2021. Now, they are very, very important, why I actually refer to those. At WHO, where I have an actual role, we do not believe that there are any safe limits whatsoever at all. But from here going forward, I'm talking about those guidelines. So that was the first one. The other thing also, all the experts agreed in Ella's case, because by the time the inquest had come to court, ULAs had started, but it was only in what we call London in zone 1 and part of zone 2. And what they all agreed is it needed to be extended. And the mayor in October 2021, he extended it up to the South Circular where we live, but he did not include it in the South Circular. I think that this needs to be very, very, very clear. So the actual road, which is the reason why Ella is not here, is actually not a part of the ULAs now. And I think that is very important that I actually stress that. Now, as her mother, from my point of view, I am going to lobby to make sure that it includes the South Circular. And also, where we live, we do have a high asthma rate there. And I always say to people, Ella was unlucky. If it wasn't her, it will be someone else. So what I have been doing now is lobbying to make sure the ULAs is extended. Because what you've got now is, you've got parts of London which have better air. ULAs have struggled to reduce PM 2.5, but when it comes to nitrogen dioxide, it's been quite significant in the fact that it is lowered. But what started to happen is, and when you look at COVID figures, there are parts of London that have better air than other parts of London. And we can't really have that. That's not really what this is all about. This should be equal, and we should all be breathing better air. So that's the first thing. The second thing the coroner said was that councils, what should councils be doing? Number one, he was very clear. It came out in the inquest that the monitoring is quite woeful, actually, and they need to improve on that. And the other thing the coroner decided also is there is a low level of public awareness. So I'm not talking about us who we are in this space. We read articles daily and there's a new IPCC report. That's not who the coroner is talking about. He is talking about Joe blogs on the streets. And what he's particularly referring to is the impact that air pollution has on health. We need to let Joe public know. Now, I'm sad to say, last year again, a group of MPs looked at this again, and nothing has improved from the coroner's verdict. So the actual low level still remains. So that's what councils need to be doing. They need to be monitoring it, not just keeping the data to themselves, no, but they need to be sharing it. What is looking like currently is people feel as if things are being done to them. A lot of people do not understand these measures. And not only councils are responsible, I have been lobbying the national government for a public health campaign since Ella's inquest. So far as to say, I haven't been successful yet. This requires education, education, education. And one of the last things the coroner came up with as well, the coroner decided that we should have known when my daughter was alive what her triggers were. We didn't. So because of that, undergraduates, so new medical students, postgraduates, and all the public bodies like the British Thoracic Society, noise guidelines, all of them need to be changed. All of them now need to have CPD about air pollution. So that's where we actually are with that right now. Now, these three things are very, very basic. However, it has turned into a bit of fight to get them. We had the Environment Act, which did not include PM 2.5, so that's still outstanding. Hence now, I have started with Ella's Law, which started off at the Houses of Lords. The whole idea behind Ella's Law, and I need to stress to people listening here, is so that the government is accountable. Currently, they're not accountable. We've left the EU, we have nothing in its place, and the OPD doesn't really have teeth, I am afraid to say. What Ella's Law will, it will make the government accountable. And the hope is within 5 years, we will get the clean air we need. Also, it does open nicely the pathway to WHO guidelines. We also, in Ella's Law, we also considered indoor air pollution. So there had already been quite extensive research about indoor air, and indoor air is just as bad as outdoor air. But due to COVID, we had to shelve that report. We've now gone back to that, and we now see indoor air as being an issue, especially in places like schools and public buildings. So again, Ella's Law is pushing indoor air. And the other thing we included, and I'm really sad to say, we didn't know that anyone was going to die from mold, but I have always known that mold has been an actual issue. So mold is part of Ella's Law. And what that again requires is local authorities to be accountable. A lot of Ella's Law is about accountability. Right now, no one seems to be accountable for anything at all. Why is Ella's Law important? We hope that clean air will become a human right in the same way water is. David Boyd from United Nations has written to Prime Minister Sunak. Our hope is if we get this through Parliament, other countries around the world will begin to adopt it. And we believe this then would reduce the number of people who are dying. The 7 to 9 million, we've been hearing it now for the last, I can't remember how many years. And my challenge to Dr. Tedros has been, what is going on? So we know 7 to 9 million people die. We know the impact of air pollution on health. What is being done about it? So that is why currently it is in the Houses of Commons, right, and we are waiting for it to go through. So that is where my campaigning is going at the moment.
Fantastic.
We want clean air to be a human right, not just in the UK, but everywhere.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And what a great campaigning message. And really interesting that you took on the issue of mold as well, because obviously that is something that is kind of out of people's control. But and also interesting that you're looking at indoor air as well as outdoor air, which I suppose we can all sort of get. Now, very pleased to welcome back to this series Kate Elliott, who is the head of the Rathbones Greenbank Ethical Sustainable Impact Research Team. And they're working on a lot of things around being able to measure and to have information on air. I mean, Rosamund was making the point that people don't really know what's going on in the world. There aren't measurements. You know, you've got what you call dirty streets, but do we actually know what these are and how we respond? So, Kate, thank you very much, and we really look forward to hearing all the work you're doing to try to rectify this. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rosie, and pleasure to be speaking to you all tonight. And as Rosie mentioned, I work within the specialist sustainable investment team of Rathbones. And when I was asked to come and join the panel today and talk about the investor perspective on air, I kind of had to sit down and have a little bit of a think about what of the many topics could I come and speak to you about. I could talk about climate change and the way in which investors are integrating risks and opportunities there into our assessments of future company profits, or kind of investor efforts to tackle deforestation through the supply chains of some of the world's largest multinationals, or indeed the carbon removal technology that Gabriel will kind of explain far better than I ever could. But what I settled on was air pollution. And I'm not going to talk to the human cost of this. I think Rosamond has very kind of heartbreakingly set that out for us already. But listening to her speak, it actually sparked a memory of when I was a primary school kid and actually taking part in a study that they were doing that was looking at the link between air pollution and childhood asthma. And I remember having these little pin badges, these little tubes that would go on our school jumpers, and it would measure the level of air pollution we were exposed to day by day, while my mum was keeping a log of my asthma symptoms. And I actually used to think it was quite cool watching that tube change from clear to grey over the course of a week. And obviously now in hindsight, recognising the significance of that and the potential harm that was identifying. But anyway, to what I do want to talk to you about today, and that is some of the ways in which the private sector can play a role in supporting kind of government and kind of government at the local or the national level in responding to this real challenge of air pollution. Some of the technologies that are being developed, being rolled out around the world today, and the opportunities that we as investors see within that space as regulation, kind of, albeit from a very, very low level, begins to tighten worldwide on this issue. I'll do a very, very quick kind of high level walk through all of these, but the first area that I wanted to talk about was sensors. Something that Rosamond has mentioned. I think it is really critical here. Even in countries where we've got relatively good monitoring in place, we still don't necessarily have clear, kind of granular level of sensors and monitoring to enable the identification of the hyper-localized air pollution impacts. And countries need to establish that ground level monitoring to yield reliable data on air pollution. Because some drivers of that air pollution are obvious. We know diesel and petrol powered vehicles, coal-fired energy generation, heavy industrial plants, but some perhaps might be less obvious. And unless you have that baseline data, one, you don't know what the scale of your problem is, and two, you don't have a kind of clear idea of any interventions that you might make, whether or not those are actually having the intended results that the policy might be hoping for. And I think the third point that's really critical in sensors, again, Rosamond picked this up, is that element of transparency, citizen accountability, empowering people to understand what the risks that they are being exposed to on a day-to-day basis, and therefore holding policymakers to account on that. So that's sensors. Another area that companies can play a key role here is in the provision of emissions abatement technology. So quite kind of fairly widespread in developed markets, but things like kind of emissions scrubbers, catalytic converters, either that go on point sources of emissions like an industrial plant or a factory, or that can be fitted to vehicles to reduce the kind of emissions at source. There's real significant scope for the rollout of those technologies in low and middle income countries. Indoor air pollution, another key area. We're seeing kind of quite a nascent area of technology, but the concept of kind of air pollution as a service being rolled out, particularly by building control companies. And this is something that has applications more within commercial property and kind of larger buildings like a hospital or a school. But just as you would get smart building technology used to kind of monitor and manage your heating and your kind of ventilation of the building to build in air filtration, and to have that linked to real-time monitoring of atmospheric and external air quality in addition to internal air quality. And the final area that I just wanted to mention is around smart traffic management. And this, again, it's very linked into that concept of sensors and the Internet of Things. So this idea that kind of devices remotely located around a city or an urban environment can be connected into the internet so that you have real-time monitoring and analysis of data, but you can also feed that into things like smart controls of traffic signals, so that either linked to air quality or just independent of that, looking at congestion levels, you can do things like change the flow of traffic around a city, prevent congestion, prevent that build-up, particularly of nitrous oxide emissions and that impact on air quality. So those are just a few of the solutions that companies are developing to help respond to this challenge of air quality. It's one of the kind of key themes that we look at within Rathbone Greenbank. We look at a set of 8 sustainable development themes. This one very much crosses over with energy and climate and with our health and well-being themes, something that we see real opportunities out there in the market for. But the size of the market for those technologies will be influenced very heavily by the level of policy commitment on this issue. To kind of bring a global perspective on the national challenges that Rosamund has spoken to, a 2021 report by the United Nations Environment Programme found that only 2/3 of countries around the world have any form of legal restrictions on air quality standards. And even kind of that quite poor coverage is probably an optimistic view, because the quality of enforcement of those standards is extremely variable across those locations. But we do see that with the clear social, environmental and economic costs that poor air quality is bringing, and as that becomes clearer and clearer and kind of more apparent in the minds of populations and governments, I can see only kind of one direction of travel with this, and the regulation tightening. And it's those companies that are helping to deliver solutions to that challenge, that are helping to accelerate a transition towards a more sustainable world. They are the ones that we see will be well positioned to benefit from this, and well positioned to perform well in the long-term future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. What a lot of things to think about in terms of where the legislative agenda should be going. Now, let's turn our attention to the world's natural removers of carbon, which are the trees, which in particular are old growth forests rather than new forests that are thrown up kind of overnight, often for completing carbon credits. And it's great to be welcoming to 5x15 and to Rathbones tonight Jared Farmer, who is the author of an absolutely wonderful book with the sublime title of Elder Flora, which has just been published in the UK, which I think does more or less what it says on the tin and takes a tour around the world's oldest trees. He has written several books about the Mormons, the Indians, as well as the American landscape. And this book takes us, Elder Flora takes us from Lebanon to New Zealand to look at the trees. And as we were talking beforehand, for anyone who watched David Attenborough last night, he was concentrating in his new series about the British Isles on the power of old growth forest and in particular trees. So from Pennsylvania, Jared, welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, Rosie, and happy vernal equinox, everyone. Today I want to talk about how trees cannot save the planet, but how our relationships with trees may help sustain our world. Humans are not the first atmospheric change makers. Plants did it first. When cyanobacteria evolved in the oceans, they precipitated an oxygenation event that was also a mass extinction. When photosynthesizers migrated to land and evolved into the megaflora we call trees, they were a step ahead of microbes, which for a long evolutionary period could not decompose lignin. The carbon inside coal is largely a legacy of primordial land plants. In the long run, lignophytes and microbes reached an equilibrium, an oxygen-rich planet with a carbon cycle mediated by plants, with forests regularly replenished by fire. This is the biosphere that mammals evolved upon and on which humans became Prometheans, first burning forests, later burning coal, releasing Paleozoic carbon into the air. Climate change realists know that decarbonization will take a few or several decades. Optimists believe we can shorten this stopgap period, and that's the great challenge of our time. Many in the public imagine trees to be a major part of the solution. It's lovely to imagine that when you purchase a carbon offset, an organic solar-powered air purifier is planted somewhere and there will grow and thrive for the next 50 years until our energy transition is complete. Alas, as Rosie was intimating, the actual record for large-scale tree planting initiatives is rather spotty. They are susceptible to fraud or corruption or negligence. They often lack local buy-in. Ironically, climate-friendly plantings are vulnerable to climate change. Hotter, drier droughts can turn grids of saplings into phantom forests. Best case scenario, you've established a plantation with little biodiversity and no chronodiversity. I'm all in favor of planting trees, but there just isn't enough land with enough water for new plantings to majorly offset industrial emissions. If you think of trees as carbon storage devices, the first priority should be preserving intact forest. Just as we shouldn't be developing any new fossil fuel reserves, we shouldn't be cutting old growth ever again. From an atmospheric perspective, old and slow beats young and fast. The slower the trees grow, the higher their potential for negative emissions. The longer they live, the longer they keep greenhouse gases locked inside their wood. As much as I love old trees, I must point out that saving peat bogs and grasslands is just as important, for grasses can store a lot of carbon too, and they lock it up primarily in their roots, where it's less at risk from climate-induced megafire. But here I want to step back from atmospheric and financial calculations. Instrumentalizing ancient trees as mere service providers, carbon in, oxygen out, is an ethical shortcoming. Ancient trees are ethical gift givers. These venerable old plants, elder flora, make us more human by encouraging intergenerational, cross-species, and cross-cultural bonds of obligation. Tree veneration is nearly universal and as ancient as can be. Now that humans have joined plants as atmospheric changers, it's incumbent upon us to imagine a future with elder flora as long as our past. So that's my ethical message. We should care for ancient trees to prolong our own humanity. I have one more topic to share though, because it's just so cool in a sciencey way. Long-lived conifers, such as the bristlecone pine on the cover of my book, allow access through their tree rings to data on ancient atmospheres. The width of their rings can serve as proxies for temperature or precipitation and can be used to pinpoint droughts and wet periods in the past. Bristlecone tree ring samples also contain rare, distorted growth layers that evidence abnormal cold. And these distinctive frost rings are a kind of signature with a date stamp, and they represent temporary global cooling that results from supervolcanic eruptions. Finally, ancient bristlecones have recorded cosmogenic signals from the isotopic chemistry of the air. Our Earth has at various times received intense influxes of radiation from the sun or distant stars. Bristlecones provide minuscule carbon storage, but they are priceless as atmospheric record keepers. They give temporal gifts to historians and scientists and to the scientific pilgrims who seek wisdom where the air grows thin and the trees grow old. Thank you.
Jared, thank you so much. Sorry, I was so busy listening, I didn't turn my sound back on. That was completely fascinating. And yes, you're completely right about we must not cut down anymore. I know in the UK we define as old growth forest as 400 years and over, and it is really shattering how much still gets chopped down every year, although now it is technically preserved in law. Our final speaker tonight is Gabrielle Walker, who's no stranger to 5x15. Gabrielle is a leading environmentalist who's been on the forefront of so many things, whether it's to do with the Arctic and the melting ice, but now she's really working hard in the space to figure out how we extract carbon from the atmosphere. And she set up her own companies, a for-profit and a not-for-profit, and she tours the world and lectures about this, as well as doing a lot of the technical stuff herself as a scientist. And so I'm very pleased to hand over to Gabrielle to try to, in a way, pull all this together. And again, going back to that IPCC report today, we've got to do this, haven't we? How far are we along this line, and are we going to be able to produce this technology? Gabrielle.
We have to, that's the only choice. And so, and thank you. I've been listening in absolute fascination to everyone that's gone before, and I'm really thinking about the topic of air. When I was asked about 5x15 about the different elements, I said, "Can I do air? Please, can I do air?" I actually wrote a book about air. I became captivated by this invisible thing that you can't even smell or taste, but that has all these incredible characteristics that we need it to live, but also it provides our shelter. And the thinking about those beautiful old trees, I'm still gobsmacked by the way that trees build their bodies out of thin air. We think about air as having oxygen that we need to live. We think about air that we need to take out the pollution that can kill so tragically. And we think about air, we don't necessarily think about air as something that builds all the plants on Earth, but it's all the body of a tree comes out of thin air. So given that's where the whole possibility of carbon removal comes into play, and some of the things that Jared was just talking about there, I'll mention too now. But first of all, what I will say is that I have been working on climate change now for 30 years. This is my 30th year of working on climate change. I feel like I want to apologize to everyone on the call and everyone who's listening, because I haven't fixed it yet. In fact, it's getting worse, but I have been trying, as have many, many other people. And one of the reasons that I'm actually working so hard on carbon removals now is that I was really shocked to find out what's come out yet again in the IPCC report. But we already know this. We've known this for at least 10 years, that there's been a growing gap between the pace at which we can reduce emissions, stop more CO2 getting into the air, and the amount that we actually need to. We've left it too late. We need a kind of time machine of 2 decades to go back and start when we didn't start. And short of a time machine, the only other way we know how to do it is we have to take carbon dioxide out of the air. And it's large amounts, it's really large amounts, it's billions of tons. And it's very, very daunting, because at the moment we're only doing that on a tiny level for deliberately induced carbon removals, and we need to get it to billions of tons. A good way of thinking about this, if you think about what happened with solar power and wind, it took about 30 years from them being a kind of good idea to be able to get cheap enough and wide scale enough that they could make a dent on this problem. So that took 30 years for solar and wind. We need to do the same for carbon removals in 10. So it's an incredibly daunting challenge to be able to scale up an entire approach, an entire industry that way. However, it's also kind of exciting because, as Jared very rightly pointed out, we can't do this on the back of nature. We can't have industrial emissions on one side and have nature try to take it all back up again. Although trees are going to be a significant part of that, as are mangroves, as are the oceans. You can store carbon in soils, you can store it in buildings, you can store it in rocks on the surface that you can grind up and put on fields that can improve the quality of the crops and also take up carbon dioxide more rapidly. You can suck it out of the air and you can store it in rocks underground. There's so many different ways that we can do it, and we're going to have to do it. It's not a kind of which is better. It's obviously better not to put the stuff in the air in the first place, but we should have started that 20 years ago. So I have these two organizations, Rethinking Removals is my not-for-profit, and Curate is the for-profit company, trying to make it easier to do this and seeing how we can build this market, build this industry. But I just wanted to sort of finish on one thing. This summer, I went to 2 extraordinary places. One was Iceland and one was Kenya. And I went to Iceland because I wanted to see, it's the first commercial scale direct air capture and storage plant. So it's this place where they're blowing air over capture devices. They've got a blimp where they've got the CO2 that they've caught, and they're actually injecting it into the volcanic rock, where over about a period of 2 years, it goes into the young volcanic rock, the CO2, and it turns into solid rock. So we're actually reversing the process. Instead of burning the coal and oil and sticking it to the air, we're actually taking it back and putting it back where it came from. So I was fascinated to see that it's quite a small plant. It's only 4,000 tons a year, and we need thousands of millions of tons, but it's a start. And when I touched it, I felt like I was touching the first iPhone, because we're going to have these everywhere. And it felt so, it's a small beginning to something that's going really big. But the other place I wanted to talk about was my trip to Kenya, because I don't really think about Kenya and Iceland as being similar. But Kenya has vast amounts of geothermal energy, just like Iceland does. And it has vast amounts of rocks where you could actually inject CO2 and make it, but none of that's being used. And the geothermal energy isn't being developed so that you can actually have use of energy for developing the whole country, because it's too expensive. So this is an opportunity now. I was talking to the people within Kenya who are working to figure out how to take what's happening in Iceland and do it in a really widespread scale in Kenya, both to be taking CO2 back out of the air and to be developing geothermal and solar and wind energy that can then be made to do a whole bunch of other things, including generating jobs and changing lives. And one of the things that I love about this is that we have had a narrative, a story all along, which is that the global South, Africa and across the global South, they're passive victims of climate change. And maybe we should give them some aid if we want to be nice about it, or social justice demands that these poor, sad victims need to be helped in some way. But that's not where we are. You know, you look at the continent of Africa, you have an incredibly dynamic entrepreneurial workforce of young people. You've got all of these resources in terms of energy. You've got all these capabilities. And this is a story that says we can both use this to help solve the climate crisis, help bridge that gap, and also use it to help Africa and other parts of the global South develop and turn into the climate warriors of the future. So I'll stop there with just one more comment about it, which is I felt the same thing when I went to these places in Africa, and when I went to this place in Iceland, and when I touched this site where the CO2 is going back down again, I felt an emotion which is very rare for those of us who work on climate change or any of these impossibly hard problems, which is I felt hope. And that's the last thing I want to offer to all of you, because that's what we face, these tragedies, we face these challenges, and what we can bring is human energy and hope. And that's how we're going to solve this.
Gabrielle, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. And what powerful images as well about Iceland, and indeed about Kenya and the extent of the energies there. First of all, I have to apologise because there's a lot of church bells going on in the background. If you think there's something sort of odd at the back of my screen, it's actually Westminster Abbey's church bells, which have now been ringing solidly since 6. I just have to say I have absolutely no idea why, but it's quite pleasant, although it might be irritating. Rosamond, can I come back to you? And I just need to say that you do have to go to join another event in about 10 minutes or so. So let's just dip down a bit into the kind of, you know, where you see the policy. Whose responsibility does this become? Not just in London, but how do you see policy successfully playing out? Because you talk, I mean, in London, you know, we have an ULEZ zone, ultra low emission zone, but it only works so far, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I don't think it's any one person's responsibility. ULEZ is one part of it. One of the issues we have with London is the wood burning as well. And we haven't mentioned that this evening. So the government is incredibly nervous about setting targets, because everywhere else in the UK is probably going to reach the 10 micrograms, apart from London. So then we have to look at London. What else is going on? And it's the wood burning. But I think I am also now, as we move further to 2030, I am mindful that we do need legislation to help us along here. This isn't just going to happen, willy-nilly. Listening to the IPCC report for today, I feel as if we have already run out of time. Well, we have. The fact that my daughter is not here tells me we've already run out of time. The number of young people dying from asthma, for example, that hasn't changed in London. But there is hope. I mean, I have to continue to have hope. And what's the hope I have? The hope I have was during lockdown, during March 2020 to the 4th of July, when the whole place was locked down, no child died from asthma in the UK. I mean, that was beyond belief. So we have to look at what was going on in the United Kingdom that has between 22 to 24 deaths of children every year still. What was going on? And it was emissions. When we were all locked down, it's not just in the UK, actually, come to think about it. I think some of you may recall those videos that there were, around the whole planet. It was as if it was something out of a David Attenborough film, that everything became cleaner. But I actually knew the moment we reopened the economy, things then went downwards. We need to do a fair balance here. Now, I do say to governments, and I'm very clear about that, you can choose not to do anything now during my lifetime, but sooner or later, you are going to be forced to do something. And in the United Kingdom, our CMO, Chris Whitty, did write quite a comprehensive report just before Christmas on air pollution and health. We also now know, this is a fact now, that all NCDs have a link with air pollution. And one of the things I'm going to be tweeting at in the next weeks are to do with dementia and air pollution, which is quite worrying. That is something we all care about. But most cancers, most heart disease, strokes, obesity, lung cancer amongst non-smokers, all of these have been shown there's a link with air pollution. And I repeat my warning to governments. It's not to scare them, but this is a fact. You pump trillions into healthcare, but this isn't going to solve it. Prevention is better than cure. And I say, not just to Mr. Sunak, to everybody else, unless you clean up the air, we are going to continue to become ill. And, in the UK right now, I think I heard the doctor say the waiting list is now 7.5 million, which is really scary. Yes, there are other factors why. And COVID might be one of it, but let's be honest, before COVID, the actual waiting list was 4.89 million in rising. So there are other things going on. And I repeat my warning, asthma is on the increase. There is now dementia, which I have mentioned, which is taking up a huge amount of the NHS budget. So for me, air pollution is about health, and we can't keep on postponing it. And one of the reasons why we make a lot of noise about health is COVID showed us people care about their health. People went to extraordinary lengths, didn't they, to remain healthy. So this is another way of getting people in. But yeah, we have run out of time in a way. And, people keep on, there's forever excuses about the economy, about this. And, even our current chancellor sort of went, I need as many people back at work as possible. Well, some of those people off work, they're actually ill, waiting for all sorts of operations. So this to me is about the health of our nations.
Yeah.
So it really is, and I must stress that it's really important. So there might be people, there are some demographics which are living longer. I accept that, but now this is turned into a matter of equality of health. So, for example, you can get a rich white man, maybe London, very, very wealthy, might live now to late 80s or 90s, go up north, a working class white man breathing filthy air, will be lucky to make 65. So the gap in life expectancy now, it continues to get wider, and we should be concerned about, all of us should worry about this. And also we are getting ill, these illnesses, you don't smoke, you're getting lung cancer and all sorts of things. So that will be my message going forward, that people need to lobby their MP to take this seriously.
I think that's absolutely right. And thank you so much. And I think, it was very interesting what you said earlier, that there is a kind of low, even though we all know about it, there's a kind of low awareness because it's this magical, invisible stuff that you can't touch, and it doesn't cause a flood or a drought, but it does cause all these insidious illnesses that kill and cause bad health. So thank you very much. And I know you have to go, but thank you for your campaigning and for joining us. Kate, can I come on to you now? We've got some questions coming in about, how someone's actually asked directly about how much money you spend working towards these ends, and what are the things that you really see that you should focus on. And again, going back to the report today, does that kind of redouble your efforts towards working with companies that are absolutely phasing out the fossil fuels, etc.?
Yeah, it's always an interesting point, because we kind of view sustainability holistically. So I mentioned the 8 sustainable development themes that are the lens through which we're assessing organisations and kind of looking to find the ones that genuinely are kind of both taking advantage of those sustainability trends, but also accelerating progress towards them. And it's really difficult to kind of look at one of those in isolation. So if we look at kind of air quality just purely in isolation, that's got so many crossovers into kind of climate change being an obvious one, habitats and biodiversity protection being another. It's almost you have to be trying to solve all of these challenges in their entirety, because if you fail on one, you're going to create ripple failures across all of them. So it's not so easy to kind of say, right, we need to be directing kind of X amount towards this. I mean, I would say from the economic point of view, and this isn't to kind of downplay the human or the environmental value of kind of environmental and social goods. It's just the way in which, I mean, a lot of our work is kind of translating moral and social imperatives into the language that companies will understand. And unfortunately, that is often the bottom line. And if we look at something like air quality and air pollution, I think there's been estimates of up to kind of 8 trillion in economic cost through the health impacts of that globally each year. That's 6% of global GDP. So even if you can kind of wash your hands of the human cost of this, of the environmental damage that's linked to it, that's something that companies and policymakers really have to wake up and take notice of.
Thank you so much for this. And audience, put in questions now to Gabrielle and Jared and to Kate, and because we're going to come to audience questions. We've got quite a lot so far, but hopefully we'll have time to get through them all. Jared, do you find that the kind of whole question of greenwash in the way that trees get planted is workable or not workable?
Well, certainly there is greenwashing at play in some of these tree planting schemes, and they've been written about. There are examples of fraud. I think it's more often just wishful thinking, though, honestly. I think we just expect too much of nature, kind of like what Gabrielle was saying, like when like the oceans and the trees have already done so much for us. Like, I mean, basically for the past couple of centuries, they have been absorbing all of this excess carbon, and to ask anything more of mangroves and seagrass meadows and trees, that's so unfair. I want to think of the natural world that has already given us such in a sense a gift of time before we even realize what a gift of time they've given us. So I just think like trees have done enough already, and they've already shown incredible resilience. We've already pushed their climate out of the way. They're living outside their climate space already. They're living out of time, and to ask more of trees after all of that just seems like deeply unfair to trees. So that to be said, like, sure, we need more trees, the right trees in the right places. You have to plan ahead. It takes a lot of work, though. It takes a lot of buy-in. It takes a lot of money. It's not the most efficient way, but it needs to be part of a solution in addition to carbon storage, but also in addition to just using less, in addition to renewables like solar energy. So it's a very complicated program, but I do want to emphasize that trees are not the answer in this way. I think trees are incredible gift givers, and we need to recognize that. And I think they're really important for helping us imagine a future.
Yeah.
That's not a doomsday scenario. I think, trees help us think in these longer durations, and we have such a long history of caring for trees. So I guess for me, like that ethical anchor for the future, like I imagine 100 years from now when we have gone through this period of overshoot and we do have a low carbon economy, and there are old trees in that future and people care about them. And those old trees are here now, they're young now. So those future oldest trees are with us. And that's what I want to think about. So I think of trees more as like these great ethical gift givers rather than this kind of answer to the carbon, sequestration or carbon storage problem.
That's such a great way to put it, that they've given us enough already. I mean, I'm always amazed because I work primarily in food politics, and I've been working on various amendments about deforestation, and I listened to Mark Carney talk last week about deforestation, and what's so extraordinary is that deforestation is talked about not adjoined to the food system, which is the reason basically that we cut down trees, that until you change the world's diet, we're going to go on deforesting the Amazon to either run cattle or to grow soy to feed the cattle. And this disjunct is very difficult, I think, that we see all these problems in acute isolation.
Yes, yes. So again, we want to keep intact forests. That's so much more important than planting new trees. And you're right. If we want the intact forest, we need to buy land to put in to give to conservation organizations to help indigenous peoples buy forests, to eat differently so that the forest doesn't have to be cut down in the first place, things like that. Yeah, the larger structural issues, which often have a real financial base. Yeah.
Gabrielle, how's the kind of carbon, all the technologies that you work on, they're presumably going to need a up and running and live carbon market in order to make them work, or does the world invest in them as a kind of universal good?
Yes, they are. And first of all, I just want to make a comment on the offsets, and I want to be a little bit challenging here. So what I'm going to say to Jared, trees are not the answer, but they are an answer. They are an answer, and nothing is the answer. So if you're looking for one answer that's going to solve everything, you're out of luck, and we're really not going to solve this.
I would agree. Thank you.
Okay, so that's one clarification. Another one I wanted to check in is about offsets, and this is related to your question, Rosie, about the carbon market. It's a voluntary carbon market in the first place, which is where people say, okay, I'm willing to do that because I want to. A company might say, I want to do that for my customers, or because I want to get some kind of you're a good brownie badge or something like that, as compared to the compliance markets, which are where governments say you have to do it or we will fine you or put you out of business. And we do need to be able to get carbon removals to scale quickly enough. We do need a very functioning voluntary carbon market where people can buy these kinds of credits, but we also need a very rapid runway towards governments actually saying, give it here, this is what you have to do, and this is what good looks like. And at the moment, as long as it's voluntary, it's still going to be a mess. But a lot of my work right now is in the voluntary carbon market. And I just wanted to make a comment about the whole debacle of offsets. So the concept that you can, if you're emitting carbon, you can pay someone else not to emit, and that kind of gets you off the hook, and you can pay $3 a ton or $10 a ton or something like that, and then you're golden, and you can just carry on doing what you're doing. It was a good idea at the time, or it seemed like a good idea at the time. It's a disastrous idea in retrospect, because all it does is encourage people to buy cheap rubbish credits instead of actually trying to do the work themselves. So that's not good. The second thing that's not good about it is applying that kind of thinking towards preserving rainforests. I'm going to be a teeny bit challenging with you, Jared, again. I'm a very, very big fan of trees and rainforests, just for avoidance of all doubt. And at the same time, I would say that the question is not what's better, to keep existing trees or to plant new ones. And that is not the question. And if it were the question, the answer would be both. We actually have to preserve existing forests, and we also have to create new ones, and we have to do much, much more than that. We have to be storing carbon, not just in biology, but also in geology. We need to be putting it everywhere we possibly can to be able to solve this crisis, and then we might have a fighting chance. So in that context, with offsets, here I'm going to do this. So an offset is kind of like, okay, so I put a ton of CO2 in the air, and Rosie, you put a ton of CO2 in the air. Bad Gabriel, bad Rosie, you've got 2 tons of CO2 in the air, and we're causing the problem. Okay, how about this? I put a ton of CO2 in the air, and I say, Rosie, how about I pay you not to put your ton in? Mm-hmm. That's an offset, but my ton's still there. It solved part of the problem, but not the whole thing. What I'm talking about with carbon removals is I put a ton of CO2 in the air, and then I find someone who can remove that ton and pay them to do that. And then you get to zero. What goes up comes down again. And to do that well, to do that with high durability carbon that stays down is actually very expensive. So it's not a kind of, let's just buy cheap offsets of $3 or $10 a ton. You're talking $200 a ton. But if you pay that, then what goes up comes down, and you can build the industry. And that's what we're in the game of. So it's not about offsets. It's not about some weird counterfactual where you say that forest was going to be chopped down honest, and so you stop the CO2 so you can carry on polluting. I personally think, and I've written about this as well, that we ought to have a completely different category of credit or financing for protection. And as Jared already pointed out, it's not just rainforests, it's also peatlands. There's so many places where nature stores carbon for us that we ought to be protecting, and not just the ones where someone's held a chainsaw to the throats of the trees and says, I'll chop it down unless you give me the money. We ought to be protecting the whole lot. And that's completely separate from this. What goes up comes back down. There's protection and there's removal. And all around the world now, this is a very exciting and positive development. In 2019, almost nobody had set net zero targets. And now, the latest count, 92% of global GDP generators either have their own net zero target or they're in a territory that set theirs. And that means they've set a date where at that point, what goes up comes back down again. And the only way that you can be net zero is either you don't emit, so you reduce as much as you possibly can, and anything that's left over, you have to take back out again. And that means that every organization, every company, every country, every individual in the world that is committed to getting to net zero will have to contribute to building this industry of removals. And that's the way we're going to solve it. So the difference is not offsets, it's removals. What goes up comes down.
Okay, so if I play devil's advocate back to you, when people talk about this kind of technology, they say it's a get out of jail free card to people who want to carry on polluting, maybe not through fossil fuels, but through rainforest or whatever they're doing. That once we have these technologies, we don't need to buy less stuff, eat less red meat, etc., etc.
So it's not just get out of jail free, it's get out of jail at £1,000 a tonne for the direct.
Who gets the £1,000?
So that's how much it costs to do it, because it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of, so it's not get jail free at all. And so if you're saying, if you can just say, okay, I don't care, I'm just going to pollute, fine, right? But you're not going to get away with that for very much longer, because customers are going to stop buying, because regulators are going to come along, because governments are going to impose this, because investors are going to say you're too much of a risk because this is coming on. So you can't get away with that. So then you have to say, what am I going to do to be responsible? And to be responsible, I either have to stop my own pollution, or I have to remove what I haven't stopped. Now, if removing is just some kind of offset $3 a tonne cheap thing, fine, it's a get out of jail quite free. But the carbon removals that I'm talking about, it's not an offset, it's a removal. They cost north of $200 a tonne on balance in a portfolio. And if you're paying that, you'll do everything cheaper first before you have to pay that. So I think it is very important. It's not just a kind of, oh, good, I can do that. But people need to be doing it now. If they sort of say, some point in the future, I'll do it, then that is a hazard. So people need to be saying, I'm going to buy this now, build the industry, prepare myself to be net zero, make sure this is available for everyone, and ultimately close that climate gap so we still have a fighting chance of keeping our targets where we need them to be.
Thank you. Thank you for
really
that.
Important
Kate, do you please come in here.
Just on the kind of role of abatement technologies, because every single credible net zero pathway out there has some element of negative emissions technology in there. We simply cannot reach net zero without that, even on the most ambitious decarbonisation. And if companies and individuals and societies are doing everything that they possibly can, and that will be transformational change in how we all kind of live our lives, there will still be hard to abate emissions. Food chain being a case in point. You can't entirely decarbonise the food chain. Therefore, we need negative emissions technologies to deal with that kind of realistically, economically, we cannot avoid those emissions. But I think it's within that hierarchy of actions, if we, as Gabrielle was saying, we need to be doing everything we possibly can up to that point, and then dealing with this and having the proper plans in place, and not thinking, oh gosh, we've got to invest in this in 2045 to meet our 2050 target. It needs to be part of the planning and the policy now so that we can scale it up to the level that is needed.
And Jared, do you see that we need to have big global finance to preserve trees, mangroves, all the other kind of the natural carbon sinks or can we expect, I mean, I know we had a briefing the other day from the president of the Maldives, talking about how 30% of his GDP now goes on rebuilding all the things that the weather is now knocking out, and another 20% of his GDP goes on paying the interest on the loans from the World Bank and the IMF with which he built the roads and the hospitals in the first place that are now being knocked over. And in the process, all his mangroves have been taken out. And what gets offered is concrete to build sea defences because there's no time for the monitors. It's a kind of, there's sort of, the world is moving, it tries to make quick fix solutions rather than the longer term things. And how do you think we should respond to that kind of problem?
It's a little outside my area, but I'll say that I'm somewhat skeptical about all these net zero pledges that are out there. I mean, to have them work, I mean, you need to have the E in the ESG really be composed of like good data, good reporting, good verification. And that needs to happen really fast. I'm all in favor of climate finance that works. And I guess just what strikes me as a historian of ancient trees is like the amount of resources, really carbon intensive resources, is going to take to get to net zero, in a sense, like to do what trees can do anyway, which is like store carbon and run on solar power. It's going to take so much energy. And so I want finance to help with that, but I also would like people to think about living a kind of life with contentment and happiness that doesn't require so much energy. I think trees are good for that too. Just thinking about, I don't know, reading a book under a tree or meditating under a tree. There's a long history of humans living a good life, maybe at a slower pace. So anyway, climate finance, very important, of course.
Okay, well, as you may be able to hear, the bells have actually now stopped and the Big Ben is now ringing 7 o'clock. So I realize that we've somehow arrived at the end of this session, and I've got lots and lots of questions here and statements, but I'm just going to read one at random here. 2 comments from Northern California. No name, but hello, whoever wrote in. Here in Northern California last week on March the 14th, Sonoma County became the first county in the USA to prohibit the development of new retail gas fueling stations to help reduce dependency, which is good. But however, he also couples this with a bit of bad news, ramping up of the bioenergy industry. This is a tricky one. Clearing forests in the name of protection from fire and so-called healthy forests and using wood to fuel biomass, bioenergy, biofuels industry. I have to say, I personally find myself very offended by the biofuels industry. I hope Gabrielle is as well. Are you, Drax, people like that?
So here's what I'm going to say now, and I'd like to, and it's also a response to what Jared said as well. If you're skeptical about net zero, so am I. We've been going in the wrong direction for a long time, and I just respectfully like to say to everyone on the call and everybody listening, please listen to me now. We have left it too late. We are not in a position where we can pick and choose about that's nice, that's not nice. So I kind of like that, but I wish it was purple. Mm-hmm. This is a real crisis. And so I will say, I'm not a big fan of using of bioenergy for its own sake. I am a fan of using bioenergy to replace some of the areas where it's actually very hard, like aviation, where it's very hard to find a solution quickly otherwise. And particularly BECCS is one of the ways that you can actually scale carbon removals, and that's using bioenergy and capturing the carbon and storing it. It's one of the few ways at the moment we can see a very rapid scalability. If there are better ways, if there are other ways, we should be going after them. And there's loads of new entrepreneurs and new approaches and new techniques that might take any of this over. But right now, I'm sad to say we are not in a position to say I quite like that one, but I don't eat the green ones. And at the same time, remembering the chaos that we're already experiencing, we haven't even got to 1.5 degrees. A third of Pakistan, it's not a small country, a third of Pakistan was underwater last year. And to sit there and say, well, I kind of like this one, but I don't like that. That's a conversation for 30 years ago. It's not now. Now it's real. We got to do it, and we've got to throw everything on the table and put everyone around the table, and then we might have a fighting chance.
Thank you for that. There's a comment in here too saying, "Can someone banish the use of the word silver bullet?" Which I think that I think you just did it jolly well. But I have to say, we do hear it a lot. Kate, any last thoughts from you before I draw the session to a close. But thank you, Gabrielle. That was a very good warning, and I agree. There is an element for us who live in these more clement climes to be a bit picky and choosy about this over that because it suits your bent better. I take it as a very, very powerful point. Kate.
Yeah, I think I'd just reiterate that. I always kind of frame it by don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know that we've got a huge kind of way to go until we are in a genuinely sustainable world, and that's not just from climate but from the health perspective, from kind of biodiversity management, all of these different factors. And I think anything that is a step in that right direction should be welcomed. Yes, it may not be kind of the ultimate solution, the silver bullet, to use that hated phrase. But I think we need to embrace innovation. I think we need to embrace ideas across kind of the spectrum of technologies that are out there, and almost see what will work and what will be the winner over the long term.
Jared, I don't think Gabrielle was meaning to be rude about sitting under a tree and reading a book, but I think her point was very well made, that we have gone now past the time where just wearing Birkenstocks and sandals is going to fix things.
I would agree, but I think also we need to think carefully about morality and ethics and just what makes a good life, and to look at our past as we look to our future, because there's lots of different models that are much less energy intensive for living a good life.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Jared. Thank you in her absentia to Rosamond, and thank you for her sharing her story about what happened to her daughter. I think this is a great clarion call. That invisible substance air has really rallied everybody to see that we don't have the time. Thank you all for listening. I hope that you've learnt lots and got lots to take away. And thank you all for all your great questions and comments. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all. Please join us again in a month's time, and we'll be looking at the last of the elements, which is fire, which is going to include volcanoes, fossil fuels, all the things that you can imagine. And till then, goodbye, and thank you again, and have a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.